Hello, I'm Ciaran.
And I'm Paul.
And welcome to episode 6 of Cave Escape. And this week, Paul and I are going to be discussing a couple of articles. My article is on vox.com. That's not Fox, that's vox.com, which is an interesting little media site which started almost a decade ago now. But they have some really interesting journalists and researchers on there. And the article's called What People Actually Mean When They Label and Attack Terrorism. And after we have a little discussion about that article, we're going to move on to Paul's one, which is in The Guardian, and it's regarding Tyson Fury's comments and free speech in contemporary British society. I think that's the best way to sum it up. But Paul's generously offered myself to start this conversation with my own article, so I'm just going to give you a little brief summary, I guess, of the article and what it means to me and its importance. Now, the author is a lady called Jennifer Williams, who I looked up briefly, and she's her background is as a political researcher, and she was a researcher for the Brookings Institute, which is quite a prestigious American political think tank, and they've done a lot of research into terrorism studies, usually from a conventional side. But this article by Jennifer, which is titled "What People Actually Mean When They Label and Attack Terrorism," which was uploaded on December 7th, I think it's really interesting and really important that we have this debate. So over the last few years, over the last few decades would probably be more accurate, terrorism has become more and more prominent in the Western world and in the Middle East especially. And it's dominated, I think, the culture and the politics of many societies. And the big issue here, or one of the largest issues, or rather one of the starting issues or the foundational issues with terrorism, is how do we actually define it? What do we mean by terrorism? And Jennifer's article explores this, and she talks about it from a legal point of view, from a political point of view, and from a more sort of scholarly point of view, and how these definitions somewhat overlap, and how each one is in its own way problematic. And she ends with the very cliched quote, which she repeats is still quite useful, about one man's terrorist being another man's freedom fighter. And I think it's the quote itself is maybe a little bit problematic, but just to talk a little bit more about the article. So she was referring to the fact that Barack Obama, in one of his recent speeches, was mentioning that particular acts, mass shootings, for example, he defined as acts of terrorism, and he left out other kinds of acts. I believe it is a shooting at an abortion clinic, and that seemingly wasn't described by America and much of the media and many of the politicians or the political class as an act of terrorism, even though it would seemingly fit into the definition that the FBI and the federal government use to label acts of sort of domestic terrorism. So there's the legal issue, and the legal issue, of course, comes down to the fact that we have state governments, international organizations who monopolize the definition and focus it primarily against their rivals and enemies, or those organizations that would essentially challenge the state, right? And the definition usually focuses on the actor more so than the act itself. So again, it's non-state actors are the terrorists. It's rarely the states. And if states are included, they're only state sponsors of terrorists, because to implicate states as terrorists would, of course, inevitably implicate almost every state around the world as a potential terrorist, and in their history having committed acts of terrorism, which wouldn't be, I don't think, an exaggeration. And the issue comes, I think, from a popular level understanding. Again, talking about the media and how we understand it and look at it in a cultural sense, and even myself as someone who teaches the subject, it's so easy to fall into the trap and the pitfall of terrorism being a purely a purely non-state phenomenon, one which is carried out by distant others over there in another land, who are often dehumanized and by this very label itself, and which is inherently completely problematic, and that the West, specifically America and Britain, and more so than many other states over recent years, have themselves committed heinous acts of terror upon much larger scales of populations with much more devastating effects. And the real issue here, more than focusing on the actor, that is either state or non-state or something in between, or the act itself, which is generally defined if we're focusing on, say, the act as the use of political violence to spread fear into a wider audience, which itself can be problematic, because how does one define political? Many critical scholars would say you'd have to include many seemingly economic actors, such as organised criminal gangs, which are just trying to accumulate capital or more money, and that the political is embedded into every aspect of our society, so you can't disentangle it from those other kinds of activities. And violence as well. I mean, what about cyber terrorism, for example? Does this stretch the definition of terrorism due to the understanding of violence too far? What about just psychological violence, which doesn't always involve the threat of force or coercion? So even a definition as broad as that, focusing on the act rather than the actor, can be problematic. And the real problem here, and it comes down to, I think, some of the issues that Paul and I discussed on the very first podcast, the introduction, and how we should understand the social world, is the fact that terrorism, as a label, is pejorative. It's a negative. That's what everyone agrees on. So when you label something or someone or some group or some people or institution as terrorist, or even an act as terrorism, it's an inherently subjective labeling and creation, and it has those political and negative implications based on the fact that it's seen as something completely bad. And there might be maybe ISIS, and I think ISIS in some of their publications will happily talk about themselves as warriors of terror, but the vast majority of times, and in vast majority of cases, it's a completely pejorative label that nobody wants, and it's usually used for completely political purposes. And when you watch the news cycle, it's so easy to get caught up in these terrorist acts as something objective, and as something that you could understand on any sort of objective level, which are out there that we can analyse. And there's a wonderful quote that Jennifer Williams in our article draws upon from historian J. Bowyer Bell, and the quote is, "Tell me what you think about terrorism, and I will tell you who you are." And I think that's a really wonderful way of summing up the inherently subjective nature of this phenomenon, and how we should reflect upon that before we go ahead and judge and label and scrutinise and attempt to analyse acts of terrorism and so-called terrorists and so-called terrorist organisations. So I think I'm gonna stop here, and I'm gonna let Paul speak now. But I just wanted to, I guess why I brought this article rather, why I brought this article to discussion is that I was impressed, I guess, with journalists and researchers using a popular medium such as Vox, which is quite popular if you haven't heard of it. And they're quite a left-leaning, I think, progressive news institution. They do some really interesting media on YouTube. But I guess it's great that this issue should be brought up, and we should definitely reflect upon it before we have any judgments on the issues of terrorism, especially when we have all these political pundits and politicians come out condemning and telling us how we should act in response to certain acts and to certain groups. And it's obviously inherently problematic and really deeply subjective. So, okay. Yeah.
I really agree with you, Ciaran. I agree with you so much that all of my points are no longer valid. But it's just it's a brilliant article. Just to bring it back to that, very concise. It's very simple. It's very accessible. I really recommend it. It instantly reminded me of a great article by Chomsky. Noam Chomsky, who's a famous leftist critic of just general kind of international relations and politics. He did an article after the Charlie Hebdo attacks earlier this year, comparing the reaction to Charlie Hebdo to the reaction to other similar attacks that the, let's say, West have done militarily to other countries, and how the reaction by Western press to Western actions is much tamer than Western press to foreign actions in domestic territory. It's very interesting. I'll link it to you. I'll put the link in the YouTube and blog info page. So basically what he's doing here is he's saying to us that when we have situations like Hebdo, where 16 journalists or so however many journalists were killed innocently in order to stop what the militants or the terrorists described as kind of propaganda, we made a massive kind of uproar about what happened, understandably, because it was obviously innocent people killed. However, there are direct parallels of what we've done in the past where nobody has blinked in comparison. So, for instance, one of his examples is the NATO bombing of a Serbian state television headquarters, which knocked radio television Serbia off the air. In this attack, which Blair described as one of his moves to stop propaganda, which Milosevic was spreading from Serbia, 16 journalists were killed. Actually, as a correction, there weren't 16 journalists exactly. There was makeup artists and so on, but there were 16 innocent people killed in this attack. So similar to Hebdo. Again, nobody questioned this and the motives or the actual kind of humanitarianism of this act. It was very much a like-for-like attack with Hebdo, which Britain and NATO and America and so on combined to do, which wasn't criticized in a similar vein. There wasn't marches where people were saying, I am Radio Television Serbia. There wasn't any sort of kind of mass outcry globally. So it was very much downplay in that sense because, well, we'll explain that later. Other examples he gives is examples like Fallujah. It's one of Chomsky's favorite examples to give about sort of Western imperialism and Western crime, war crimes, where the Americans... It was actually a New York Times article front page. The Americans launched into Fallujah Hospital in Afghanistan, laid patients and hospital employees on the floor. Armed soldiers made them tie their hands behind their backs and occupy the hospital, saying that it was a justified act because apparently the hospital was a kind of propaganda weapon for militants. So again, propaganda was here seen as a good reason to attack innocent people. Hospitals mostly have innocent people. And then, another example he uses, which I'm sure you'll use, Ciaran, is the drone strikes that Obama endorses, where, civilians are killed on a regular basis. He talks about a drone strike in December last year, 2014, where 50 civilians were killed, which didn't get any reportage in the Western media. So he's showing the kind of difference of what we perceive as terrorism here and how we portray it as the acts of others, killing innocent people for completely ununderstandable reasons. But actually, when we attack people for what are actually similar reasons, propaganda against us, that's seen as justified, and it's not portrayed as a crime. It is as well when innocent people are also killed without trial and without any sort of kind of actual public backing. A lot of the time, that's usually the NATO bombing campaign. There wasn't a referendum on that, like there was the Syria strikes this year, I think. So I think what he's saying about subjectivity and the fact that it's non-state actors usually is so relevant, because what's happening here is we're picking what's terrorism so as to suit our needs and to simplify the actual kind of global conflicts that we are part of, and we're making war into good versus evil. These are actually words Blair used in the Serbian Civil War, Yugoslavian Civil War, where in order to kind of better portray our motives and our side. So I do think that the use of terrorism is actually usually used for propaganda reasons. And I think, as the Vox article highlights, there are so many, actually racist white people serial killings, or other kind of far right attacks on innocent civilians in Britain as well, in America, that don't get any sort of coverage as a terrorist attack. So why is it that if somebody kills for a far right group that is ethnically white, that isn't considered a terrorist attack in the same way that somebody killing for an Islamic group who's far right, why isn't that a terrorist attack as well? It's just a great way to dehumanize and to therefore kind of separate us from others. And actually, funny enough, Ciaran, before this podcast, I was talking to you about G. Harley John, and how yesterday I was watching a video of him in which he's kind of rapping to an audience and speaking about his life. And one of the most striking aspects of this, I really thought beforehand that he was some kind of radicalized nut job. To be frank, I thought that I'd see a video of him and I think, wow, how can I associate with this person? But he was remarkably human. When I watched the video, you could see he was a very flawed person with emotional difficulties and a lot of hatred and anger, but he wasn't somebody I could not associate with in a way where he even had a London accent. He's clearly brought up in Britain for a long time and had probably some cultural tendencies from Britain. So to see him in this kind of human light completely changed my opinion of how people are even radicalized to become terrorists. I realized actually that this whole idea of them becoming radicalized to join some kind of other side is also portrayed poorly in order to suit our needs, to kind of, again, separate us from them and disenfranchise us. And as soon as I saw that, I had a debate with my friends. We watched the video, and I was saying, I don't see the difference between, obviously what J. John did was awful. I'm not going to endorse that anyway, but I don't see the difference between going off abroad and killing people abroad, and some mercenaries come from Britain to fight in Syria and so on, to fight ISIS, and nobody questions their mental health state or their actions as kind of immoral or anything like that. And even here, if you were to join the army, you're essentially going to be sent off to a place like Syria to kill people as well. Truthfully, honestly, you're not going to be doing it in kind of the brutal ways that ISIS are doing. That is true, but you're still committing to a cause to kill people, and you should really, well, they don't all know, but the truth is, with any kind of military action, innocent people will be killed as well. There can be misfires where there are innocent deaths and so on. So it's just been interesting to see how the media have actually, well, not the media, it's just by themselves, but the government as well, and all these sort of political elites and so on, how they have actually twisted a label to just to suit their needs and just to be adaptable to kind of sway the public, essentially, and to convince the public. It's so 1984, it's ridiculous. I'm not sure how you feel about it, Ciaran.
No, I mean, I agree totally. And the real problem with all of this, of course, is the fact that it has a real, genuine effect upon people's emotions. I will talk to family members and friends, and they have this huge worry and concern about ISIS, and there's and they portray this really dehumanized, completely almost alien force, which seems to be occupied by monsters and ghouls who are willing to commit all sorts of heinous acts to get their way. And it completely blinds them to the fact that their own governments, which allegedly represent them and their actions in a so-called democracy, will be doing the same thing, sometimes behind closed doors, sometimes even overtly, and they're just not very aware that their actions cause such terror in so many other societies. I mean, you mentioned drone strikes, extraordinary rendition, all the torture black sites that the CIA and other countries around the world run, Guantanamo Bay. I mean, it's great to use, obviously, the UK and the US in particular as examples, because they're the alleged paragons of freedom and democracy and human rights, right? They're the shining light, allegedly, that the rest of the world should follow. And when these same institutions carry out acts which are clearly acts of terror, and they're clearly acting in a terrorist capacity to scare societies and whole groups of people and nations and regions into doing what they want them to do, it completely undermines their rhetoric, and it can have a very, I think, emancipatory effect, because you have to sit there. I have to sit there and explain to and have discussions with some friends and family members that, look, this is obviously really bad and nobody would condone what's going on there, but you really have to look at the history of what the West has done, the manipulation, the encouragement of genocides, I don't know, even if it's indirectly, and ethnic cleansing, such as the case in Indonesia in the 1960s. I mean, all sorts of atrocities. And in Western Europe during the Cold War, of course, all the false flag attacks where you had special forces, extra-legal ones, allying themselves with neo-Nazi factions in society and carrying out bomb attacks to be blamed on communists and anarchists and other left-wing groups all around Europe. I mean, all sorts of really, really horrible, destructive positions. And of course, the one which I always come to, the fact that the West's dear ally, as I put it on Facebook a few weeks ago, Saudi Arabia, whom behead more people than ISIS, or they have this year and last year. And on a single day, I believe, they decided they were going to behead over 50 people, many of whom were just dissidents who didn't like the government's policy, and they weren't Sunnis, they were Shia, and so they're a minority in the country, and they're not liked by the rest of the population, and they're protesting against the government. So, well, that's not good enough. You're going to have your head cut off. I mean, why is that so different from what ISIS is doing? How is the terror inflicted upon those minorities and the society in general? Because it's a monarchy, right? Don't be swayed by these nonsensical so-called local elections that they're holding in Saudi Arabia, which have happened twice, right, in the last 60 or 70 years of their history. And finally, a woman is allowed in some sort of political office. But women aren't allowed to talk to people directly to campaign. They have to go through men to do that, which is really bizarre. I have no idea how they managed to run those campaigns. So well done.
Can add as well, they have to, even just a tweet, they have to have a man tweet for them, which is hilarious.
Yeah, it's really quite ridiculous. And, a country that we support strongly and stand side by side with and vote for them to be on the Human Rights Council of the UN. I mean, the hypocrisy and the contradiction, it undermines their narrative, which is great, but it's something we have to remind ourselves and remind others about, those of us who know, to really counter this alien other image of these groups in the Middle East, which seemingly are just pure evil, and not looking at the wider political context of why exactly have these organisations formed, why are they carrying out such atrocities, and why are they using acts of terror. Is it because they've all been completely and utterly brainwashed by an ideology, or are there wider political, economic and societal issues at stake here? And I think the obvious answer is, of course there are. And unfortunately, the one which few people in the West like to even recognise is the fact that Western foreign policy towards the Middle East for the last, 2 centuries, I'd say, has been, at the very least last century, has been absolutely appalling and led to, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say, millions of deaths, either directly or indirectly. And to wonder why certain groups form that start committing these acts of terror, without looking at that wider context and the oppression and the destruction of some of these societies which have been inflicted upon them by our very governments, is completely nonsensical. And it really pains me to listen to these politicians like Cameron last year in a speech on counter-terrorism, talking about that. He directly said this has nothing to do with the political or economic conditions in these countries. It has nothing to do with Western foreign policy and the grievances about that. It's all 100% to do with a vile ideology, this Islamic extremist ideology. Of course, any expert will tell you it's complete and utter nonsense that that's the case. And if anyone looks into it more deeply, you're going to find out that, this is why these particular people joined this organisation. And many of which are sort of political amateurs and know very little about religion. There's a famous case recently of some people who were attempting to join ISIS, I believe, or they allegedly went into Syria, and they had the book The Idiot's Guide to Islam with them, and stuff like these people. They're not well versed in the so-called, you know, in the so-called religion they're meant to be representing to fight for. So, are these deeply, you know, devout religious extremists who feel that this is the only way to truth and to serve God, or do they think they're acting in a more defensive capacity because they've seen nations with very similar people being utterly undermined, manipulated and destroyed by more powerful forces, and some of which might think, I don't think this is right, and you know, some people think their ability to protest this in a peaceful manner is not, you know, they can't accept that personally anymore because they've seen too many of the atrocities, and they feel they have to go out and physically do something. And I'm not defending these people's actions because I don't condone violence, but we really have to look at it in a more reflective way. And it really pains me to myself, because obviously I teach terrorism and I'm studying it from a critical capacity, that I have to speak to my closest family members and friends to explain to them that look, you don't need to go around sending militaries into the Middle East to try and what you think solve some of these issues. You know, that's what caused them in the first place. Do you not understand that?
Yeah, well, to be more specific, if you look at ISIS now, well, you know, Assad is not somebody who's a very amiable person, but before we were involved in trying to topple him, ISIS was struggling. A group like ISIS was struggling to have any sort of hold in Syria, where a powerful dictator like Assad was around. So when we kind of give these quick ad hoc reactions to what we deem as unnecessary people or unnecessary regimes and try to replace them, we actually open up a whole other mess where we just stuck our nose in it and not actually really seen a bigger picture. So it's also worth bearing in mind that, well, like you say, not only the West sometimes even endorse terrorism, like we have done with Al Qaeda, who we you know, funded to fight off the Soviets, but you know, in the case of Assad and so on, by being kind of overzealous and trying to interfere in foreign states, we've actually kind of created holes and vacuums where terrorism actually springs out of. You know, people forget that things like bombings and war in general kind of degrade morality and attract people who want to seize power in any way. You know, we always talk about how, say, in Europe, times of recession and crises and economic problems give rise to far-right parties and far-left parties. Well, imagine after a war. Imagine you've been through a war where your family's killed and you've seen all sorts of horrible things. At that point, your ideas, your standards and ideas of morality are even more warped, and even more far-right and far-left groups come across who much more, you know, who you support, who have much more kind of degraded understandings of what humanity is. So it's a kind of vicious circle, and it's just a classic. It's one of the many vicious circles that we unfortunately see in the world, where we have we keep playing the same role. And actually, me and you, by complaining about it, are also playing the role of the people who perhaps see what's the events are happening in a different way to others. And what worries me is that we are just a part of a circle as opposed to breaking it. It's just that it's a very sad state of affairs. I don't really see an end to it, and this kind of new ISIS problem. The most worrying part is that it's not new. You know, as you're saying yourself, Ciaran.
No, yeah, I would agree, and I think we can get into it, terrorism and issues related to terrorism, on later podcasts. But I mean, I'd mention now very briefly before we move on to your article, Paul, about
Tyson Fury.
Tyson Fury. Sorry, yeah, I was thinking of Mike Tyson. I thought, no, he's just named after him.
Yeah,
Tyson Fury. That many of these political actors in the West, and although it's very controversial to say so, and of course many of the elites would never admit it, they benefit a great deal from having these terrorist organizations to scare the public, right? It's a part of legitimizing their own power, forming identity. There's even can be direct economic benefits for the military-industrial complexes in the West and other economic actors to promote this conflict, Right. So it's a whole cycle which I believe now from the research that I've done over the last 5 years or so, that the politicians and the corporations and all of the elites, if you want to call it a transnational elite in the West, they benefit too much from these threats and from these conflicts. Why would they want it to end when they can increase their own power, status and money if it continues? I mean, that's a really sad fact of life. Well, I'm calling it a fact. Some people would obviously dispute that, but from the research that I've done, that's one of the saddest things, is that there are so many powerful people which benefit from the labelling of terrorism, to the fighting of terrorism, to any aspect of it, and why they would want to stop it. I don't see many reasons for why they would want to stop it, unfortunately, other than moral and ethical ones, which very few, and seems fewer, politicians would really want to stand up for.
Absolutely. We're going to move on to the Tyson Fury article.
Yeah,
now,
is that okay? Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great debate. Unfortunately, it's such a large one that you could digress in any direction. So I'm going to bring up the freedom of speech article. I want to bring up, which is about Tyson Fury. It's obviously a very current debate. For those who don't know about it, Tyson Fury is a heavyweight boxer who recently beat Vladimir Klitschko, who's a heavyweight champion for a very long time. It's a very big win, it's a big victory, and Tyson Fury was a massive underdog. So it was a big surprise. Since then, he's been kind of nominated for the BBC Sports Personality of the Year, and he's had a lot of praise and so on. Unfortunately, for those who didn't know his prior background and who now do know, as he's more mainstream because of his success, certain comments have come out that are, to be honest, quite, for me, are not very favourable. He's come out and he said, these comments kind of become part of the wider scheme, where in various interviews he said things like, he said things like homosexuality and abortion and paedophilia need to be abolished before the devil comes home. He also said that he also told a journalist in the same interview that his entourage would break his jaw because he wasn't happy with the interview the way it was going. Even more recently, that was a very old interview, that was a few years back, I believe. Even more recently, he was talking about a fellow BBC Sports Personality of the Year nominee called Jessica Ennis-Hill. She's a very good athlete if you don't know her. She's an Olympic kind of poster girl. He was talking in another interview. He was talking about how even though she's won quite a few medals, but actually she also is quite good looking. She slaps up good as well, was his actual words. He added to that, when she's got a dress on, she looks quite fit. This is before the Klitschko fight. This is in an IFL interview when he said this. So since then, these kind of comments have come out, and he's had to defend them a few times. He's come out since then in a BBC Two radio interview and said that he doesn't hate anybody. He just attacks people. He just kind of believes in the Bible. He says, "My Lord and my Savior is Jesus Christ." He teaches love, but so his views are actually to do with the Bible and religion, and they're not actually about him disliking homosexuals or Enos Hill and so on. He's also not helped himself and actually added to the sexist comments by saying that his wife knows her place and that's just the way they live and so on. So there's been a big backlash on top of that against him, where people have talked about actually having him removed from the BBC Sports Personality of the Year, and there's been a massive petition and a big outcry about it, about getting rid of him, and it's a debate that's ongoing. BBC have refused thus so far to actually remove him, but people such as Umuna, the Labour MP, have come out, the Shadow Cabinet Minister have come out and criticised it, so it's become a very big deal. What I kind of want to talk about is actually who Tyson Fury is. I haven't said this before, but he's actually got traveller backgrounds, or if he calls himself the king of the gypsies, or gypsy traveller, if you're going to be more specific. I'm not sure if that's PC, to be honest. And on top of that, he's also somebody who's actually quite vulnerable, and I think those two things are actually quite important. They're quite worth bearing in mind when we're talking about freedom of speech, because it's been quite a big backlash. Quite a lot of people attacked him. And on top of that, I just want to talk about freedom of speech in general, because I think it's a very interesting debate. I massively believe in freedom of speech, but I also believe in protecting people who are vulnerable and could be not just say things that are kind of undefendable, such as Tyson Fury, but also I think people who are vulnerable can be persecuted through speech, and that needs to be defended against as well. So it's a very hard balance to get. I was going to continue, Ciaran, unless you have something else to say yourself. Or...
No, that's fine. You continue, and then I'll put in my 2 pennies afterwards.
Brilliant. So one thing I want to bring up is I actually think Tyson Fury's background, when people attack someone like Tyson Fury or somebody who basically has views that are kind of maybe not... I can't prove right now that they're against what the majority feel, but they're definitely against what a large proportion of people feel. A lot of people are obviously not homophobic and obviously do believe in abortion and are feminists and so on. So they don't like what he's saying, and that's how the petition came about. The problem is when there's such a big amount of people come through and attack someone like Tyson Fury, I think they kind of. It can get to a point where I actually almost feel sorry for the chap involved, because it's almost oppressive. It's almost like, this person here can't have these views and they can't be endorsed. But the truth is that people are talking about him being a role model and so on. I think someone like Tyson Fury doesn't see himself as that and shouldn't be ever seen as that. I think he's somebody who's actually very vulnerable. He's somebody who's battled with depression beforehand, and he's got a very difficult background coming from the traveler life, and it means that his views are by default just different to ours. And the fact that he's not saying. It's complicated. He's obviously very conflicted within himself, and he's now become a public figure from a very humble background. It means that he's unable to kind of actually understand things like public relations and how to act in front of cameras. A lot of people out there, I think, would have not necessarily as awful views as he does, but they would have similar kind of dislikable views. They're just much better at hiding it. This guy isn't. He's coming from somewhere where he even though he says he doesn't dislike homosexuals, he believes in the Bible, which does dislike homosexuals, or does kind of how to say abhor them and so on. He's clearly conflicted, and he's even reading the Bible. He's even interpreting the Bible poorly, and it's down to the fact that, and I've done some research on this now, and it's about the kind of traveler faith. Because there's a lot of kind of evangelical and Pentecostal movements within these communities that kind of mean that people take the Bible in a certain way, and it's very extreme. They have this kind of homophobic edge. But the truth is, and there's a person who's a chief executive of the Traveler Movement, her name is Yvonne McNamara. What McNamara says quite perceptively is he's hiding from the unknown, and he's using the Bible to justify it. The problem is that with someone like this, who doesn't clearly know what he's talking about, and has these conflicts and has these mental health issues, is that by kind of chastising him and publicly attacking him for what he says, we're actually not helping him. We need to have a debate as opposed to actually kind of trying to destroy this person. This is what McNamara says, and it's a brilliant point, which I agree with. Another person called Jack Bowers, who's a gypsy journalist and blacksmith. I don't know, he could be both. He was saying that basically a lot of these people who are gypsy travelers, they actually have a very literal interpretation of the Bible, because that's often the first book they've read. So we're talking about a group of people, or nice, we can put it more generally as well, but let's say specifically this gypsy traveler, Tyson Fury, he's a person who specifically comes from a background where he's not put off on a good foot, and when he comes down to the mainstream society with different views, it's a whole new world to him. We've attacked him. I don't think he's much of a threat to actually, people call him a role model. I don't think what he says is actually going to necessarily spread homophobia or spread sexism or so on. And I think that by just kind of blocking him out and trying to say we're not going to listen to him, we're not going to hear him, we're not actually helping people in the long run. We're just kind of saying that there's only one viewpoint and we can't discuss things. The truth is, and I think you agree with Ciaran, I'll let you step in, is I think when you actually open up to debate, you can actually criticize people like Tyson Fury. You can say things like, you're misinterpreting the Bible. You have what you're saying about sexism is not obviously even applicable to current society, where women actually have roles which are completely unlike yours. You can start to kind of actually counteract what he's saying through good, academic, well, not even academic, but just general debate, I think. And I'm sure you agree, Ciaran, with that. I know you have beforehand.
Yeah, I mean, freedom of speech it's always tricky, and it seems to change depending on how public your speech is, which is unfortunate. There seems to be there's a tendency to have a lack of principle. And what I mean by that is if you're a celebrity and you say something which is controversial, you're going to be sort of socially crucified, so to speak, for that view, and all sorts of organisations and groups are going to mobilise against you depending on their views. Some may support you, and it's this huge battle, and it can really affect that person's life directly. To the point that there's a possibility that he won't win this sports person. He won't even be on the shortlist for the Sports Personality Award, which is really problematic, I feel. And I think the irony in some of the forces which are so condemning of people's views, which are, you can say, are unsavoury in their opinion, or just offensive or insensitive, or inflammatory, whichever adjective you want to use. I think that the irony is that these people are meant to be sticking up for certain groups' rights, but then they end up squashing everybody's, because everyone's an individual, everybody's rights based on individual freedom of speech. And I very rarely think it's a good thing to censor and penalise someone to the extent that, like you said, I mean, this is a person from a very particular and quite, let's face it, odd background. You said before he suffered from depression, and by odd I mean I don't know how many travellers there are around Europe, but they're very, very much in a small minority. I couldn't imagine it being more than 10 or 20 million. I must admit I don't know the figures, so I shouldn't assume that, but what I mean is he comes from a very, like you said, a very specific background with a very, many would consider very strange upbringing, with some cultural outlooks and ideas which are very most of society would consider archaic and seemingly reactionary this day and age. But it really pains me when people's freedom of speech are completely ignored over other people's so-called alleged offence to that freedom of speech. Because I don't think that's the best way to deal with it, and I think it ends up harming everybody else's rights at the same time. For example, the freedom to express yourself, which involves speech and using almost any other medium you can think of to express yourself. It's not just that you as an individual person have that right. It's also that everybody else also has a right to listen to that information. That is to say, they themselves aren't censored from hearing that, and they have the ability themselves to judge the rightness or wrongness or the morality or what have you, or any other judgment or interpretation of that speech which is being given, right? So it doesn't, when you censor someone, you're also saying that nobody else, we're not going to allow anybody else to listen to this person. Like, you can't be trusted to listen to this person because it's going to it might offend you, it might scare you, it might change your idea. I mean, it's hampering on everybody's rights, and I think we all have a right to receive information just so much as individuals have a right to and seek that information, just as individuals have a right to impart and express those particular views and speeches. And so I guess that's my general opinion. But having said that, it is difficult because no society tolerates freedom of speech completely and utterly. And that is to say, nobody would tolerate it if the type of speech or expression that was being espoused was inciting violence and threatening somebody else, and perhaps even if it was fraudulent. I mean, if it's based on false information, and it's completely, what's the word for it? I've forgotten the word for it. Not when it's like liable, when you're giving out false information and trying to discredit that person, right? It's slander. That's what I was looking for. So it can be problematic. I mean, I think there are some limits, and we should really reflect on how reciprocal or reciprocity, how that can perhaps mould and frame the way we ought to, as an individual and as a group, as a society, think about our own freedoms and freedom of speech. That it, the golden rules and is always the favoured one, and I think is a very important moral principle that's worthy of mention. The idea that you should behave and act towards others how you yourself would like them those others to behave towards you. And obviously with freedom of speech that can be a little bit tricky, but I just worry that the same mechanisms and the same social pressure which are used to clamp down on potential people who have controversial views, that can then spread. And you can use those same mechanisms, especially if they're empowered by the state, which has the claim on legitimate monopoly of force and, more often than not, just general power. They can use those same forces to shape other issues to the detriment of everyone else. Ones which might be more mainstream and more acceptable, and then we're worrying about, wait, hold on, how comes they're allowed to do that and do this? And you think, well, we gave them the power to do this so they could stop this one particular person espousing sort of hate speech. I'm sorry if I'm not making that much sense there. It'd probably be better if I used a real world example. I just couldn't quite think of any. But,
it's funny, you make a lot more sense than I do, Ciaran.
But again, I would just have to reiterate that the right to be heard is an important one, and like you said, when people have such seemingly reactionary or controversial views, I think the best way to deal with them is not just to ban it or censor it, or demand that they have no presence in the public, but to, more often not, just mock it and ridicule it as ridiculous and point out the weaknesses and point out the flaws and the problems and faults in the argument. I mean, this is the one really beautiful thing about that level of freedom. It definitely has that effect of allowing you to highlight the contradictions in issues that elements in society might be espousing. I mean, we just talked about it with regards to terrorism, and I mean, we live in a society now where if you say you support ISIS or you support Al Qaeda, there's a real potential that you can have your freedoms limited, and at the very least you're going to be spied on extra carefully, and they have the potential of taking away your freedom of movement, and then if you do move out of the country, they can now take your citizenship away, and a lot of that is, it doesn't seem directly linked, because you think, well, we're talking about terrorism, not freedom of speech, but I do worry that it can be a slippery slope from censoring one person because we don't like their views, and especially if we start putting that power into institutions, quite influential and dominant institutions in society. I guess that's the main thing I had to say about that.
Well, certainly, I think the problem is that essentially what most people worry about is the kind of threat and the kind of the silence of the threat of what somebody says. So for me, I particularly find Tyson Fury pretty, kind of, how can I say this? I don't see him as much of a danger. Essentially, he's somebody who has very, archaic views, like you say, and very, unsavory views. But the truth is, maybe it's just my own personal way of thinking, and maybe it's because I know that if I had come back using Tyson Fury as a role model, my parents would have definitely disagreed with me and had a good go at me for thinking how he does. But I don't see him as somebody who would actually have a wide-arcing kind of fan base that he can manipulate and make them think this and that. It takes a lot to be able to change people's viewpoints, and to actually be able to use quite anti-mainstream ideas to kind of unite people around it. Someone like Tyson Fury hasn't got that. He's just somebody who's very flawed. He has a background where he grew up with his parents hitting each other, beating each other up. I mean, I've even got a quote here about how his mom had 14 pregnancies, and only 2 of them were successful. He's grown up in a very difficult environment, and he's just expressing his views that are baseless, essentially, and then they're based in the Bible, and therefore they're very strong, right? But when someone like Donald Trump comes up, who's a politician and possibly somebody who could become president of America, that's a bigger threat, right? So when he says something like, I want to close the borders to Muslims, suddenly that is actually more serious. That's somebody saying, that's almost kind of Nazi-esque, kind of excluding one, ethnicity from a country because they're seen as a threat. So now, his words have much more meaning in the grander scale of things.
Right, but I would say just because he has that influence, say, Donald Trump, should we limit his freedom of speech because he has such repugnant views? The same way, should we limit neo-Nazi or communist, other radical and extremist political opinions because of their views? Is that the best way to deal with it, even on a practical level, where it creates almost an underground, not quite economy, but network of, usually online, of extremist views? And it's always the problem when it seems to be the best thing to deal with when somebody's expression is so perhaps repugnant, is to undermine it with your own freedom of speech by mocking it, pointing out how ridiculous it is, how old-fashioned it is, how draconian it is, how it's based on a fiction, or a fictional text from the past, which is, many thousand, over thousands of years old, so, or who knows,
No, I agree. I think my point is, though, that there's a scale, isn't there? So what I'm trying to say is a threat, and how realistic threat is what kind of strengthens or weakens that scale. So someone like Tyson Fury is somewhere, I don't know, not in the middle, but he's towards the kind of quite, scary threat. People feel threatened by him, but I don't think he's that high up. Donald Trump's the next one. But when you come to things like personal threats and harassment, that's when somebody freedom of speech, as you're saying, is more debatable. If somebody came up to me now that I knew and said, I'm going to come to your house, you have this address, I'm going to burn it down, I'll take that as a threat, and I'll take that as harassment. I would think that that's something that the police could get involved in. You see what I'm saying here is that it's about how much people feel threatened, and that's something that people can misuse as well and make you feel more threatened in order to kind of stop more freedom of speech. But the question is that, would you, for instance, say, and I'm not saying I agree or disagree, I'm just thinking about this out loud almost, would you say that even, say, harassment and threats like that could be kind of like just kind of criticized and satirized in order to kind of minimize their effect? Or do you think that that's something that is a case of freedom of speech where it should be kind of stopped by, say, police or some kind of security force?
Yeah, it's really difficult, especially with a term like harassment, because I'm not entirely sure when we break that definition down, what does that mean? What does something have to have done to myself to qualify that as harassment, and then it becomes it can be deemed legally in court as a criminal issue? I don't know the exact terms of that definition, and the other problem is the subjectivity of it, because some people are a lot more sensitive to harassment and offence, just offensiveness in being offended in general, compared to others. And some people won't be offended by certain issues when perhaps they have every right to be offended, and they will either shrug it off, or they'll mock it, or they will think this person's an absolute moron, and they won't give any time to them, and it's difficult where we draw the line is basically what I'm saying. And if we draw the line too far in favour of anything that a person or group or individual deems offensive, it completely shuts down almost all aspects of free speech, because when one person is offended, or even a group of people, it can be a highly subjective matter. It's difficult to objectify such things, especially so on an individual level. Of course, I mean, like I said, I talked about the fact that inciting hatred and even fraud in speech, where to the point of slander and threats of violence and coercion, and obviously, but even psychological damage. Like you said, harassment would probably be one of those. But there might be one case where there's, a person. I can't think of it. I don't know any off the top of my head, but we can think of an example of somebody being harassed in a manner in the workplace, and maybe some sexist comments. Maybe it happens 2, maybe it happens 3 times, and it doesn't happen again. And there might be one lady who feels really threatened by this, and feels it's a form of harassment or sexual harassment or abuse, and wants to take some sort of legal action. And then there may be somebody else who thinks, oh wow, although I don't think it's harassment, I just think he's a moron and he's a sexist pig. And I mean, I don't know, I'm probably digging myself a deep hole, but what I'm saying is it can be quite, I don't know how you objectify the offence. I don't know how you objectify
but I think in this case, the harassment is the same. It's just that somebody else has a different view of it. So they both have the right to kind of classify as harassment. It's just that whether they want to act on it or not is different. Is that not the case?
Yeah, I guess so. I probably used a very poor example there, and I would actually agree with you. You're right. You're right. But I can't think.
Yeah.
Did you understand what I was trying to get at?
I see what you're saying. Sensitivity makes things very hard to make. Yeah, objective is a very well paid point, and I think that's what I'm trying to get at, and that we have to protect people who do feel sensitive to certain things. I think there's a case of that, but there's balance within that, and I think within society we never actually really discuss how to achieve that balance. We kind of have ideas of what is, we have such multiple ideas of what freedom of speech is, but we haven't got actually a coherent one in totality. So when things like Donald Trump or Tyson Fury happen, people kind of find it okay to, well, I mean, they're not really denying freedom of speech. They're using democratic actions to kind of as a lashback, but they're also kind of saying you can't say this in society, you can't say this in public, right? But whether that is as threatening as personal harassment is another case. And is it ever justifiable to stop freedom of speech? Is it ever justifiable to say you can't say that? Or is it just a kind of case of total freedom? It's just that classic idea of where the line is. And I think that we often get it wrong. And like you say, it's often very manipulated. And I want to end on even the Charlie Hebdo attacks you brought up in the last little section, but that was a classic example of completely different ideas of what freedom of speech is, So when it comes to the kind of the Muslim baiting, as some people said, and attacking the Muslims, which ended up with the attacks, a lot of people brush over the fact that in 2008 the magazine fired one of its cartoonists for actually creating anti-Semitic cartoons. So Charlie Hebdo here, in 2 instances, has shown that actually it's okay to criticize Muslims, but it's not okay to criticize Jewish people. And they defend their freedom of speech to criticize Muslims, but they didn't defend their freedom of speech to let journalists to attack Jewish people. So here again, why is there that kind of discrepancy? And then the government even, there's a classic example people use about the comic, I'm going to mispronounce his name, Julian Mabala. He's a comedian who's also been kind of he's been attacked by the government for inciting hate crimes and for being anti-Semitic, and he's going through criminal trials as a consequence. So again, the government's saying here that anti-Semitism is punishable, but things like Charlie Hebdo being, say, Islamophobic isn't, So it's interesting to see how that government can justify that. How it can justify attempting to imprison a comic. And I think, to be honest, the comic's views are pretty abhorrent as well. I don't really know them. I know that I think he's a Holocaust denier and so on. He's obviously got some pretty undefendable views, but they're saying, at this point, where the government drawing the line here, and where are they saying it's acceptable to make fun of this religion but not that religion? And I'm interested to see how they can actually justify that. I don't know how you feel about that.
No, there's some really good points actually, Paul. And I must admit, I think you've thought about this more than I have today. And to try and dig myself out of that pit, I just want to bring in the fact that I completely recognise and sympathise with historically. And why we are so sensitive now, which actually probably in the long run it's not a bad thing, because historically minorities or those disempowered groups in society have been completely discriminated against and penalised through the freedom of speech of the dominant or more powerful group. So whether it's in Western society, whether it's women or homosexuals or any other groups or ethnic minorities, for example, that like you talked about the Charlie Hebdo example, which is really prudent, but just historically it was even more severe, right? That the powerful group had the freedom to attack and discriminate and mock those less powerful in society with their use of so-called freedom of speech. And it wasn't simply enough to be able to undermine and mock them because they were sort of the dominant, most powerful and almost influential group. So I think it is problematic, and I apologise for my weak reasoning before, but I guess what I was
well, this is part of the debate, is to understand, we were putting kind of stream of consciousness, we were kind of debating within it. Do you know what?
It would have been a lot better if I said, if somebody mocked me for being part Irish and stuff, I would, okay, maybe a small part of me, because I have an ego, like all humans do, unfortunately, or most of us, part of me would be a little bit sort of offended, like, oh, you shouldn't judge me just because I'm part Irish. But another part of me would think I wouldn't want to be able to send the police in to stop that man from saying that, if that makes sense, and shut him down because he said something which offended me. That's what I was trying to highlight in my subjectivity and where we draw the line. So,
I think the difficulty is that the two of us have never clearly been part of a minority group, and this is the problem, is that, like, as you're saying, historically, and I'm not saying that I'm not sure what I really think. It's something I still debate in my head, but historically we've not been through these problems. We've not grown up as black women or men who have had people calling them the N-word, for instance, throughout their life, where that would actually mean that these people will possibly lynch you later or lynch your family members, that was what people grew up with. They associated those words with that. And if someone was to call you the N-word now on the street, you might associate with that incident. And I have no kind of history where, okay, I'm maybe Eastern European, but we out of all the ethnic groups, we get it pretty easy. I've not got a history of where I can actually feel like threats from people's words, but some people really do. And so back in the day with racism and sexism and so on, some people really do have a history of threat, and I can see where that fear comes from. So I'm very divided on the issue, and I'm not sure where I stand, because I do believe in freedom of speech totally. I mean, like you're saying, with these petitions and so on, the worst I can say, the thing I can say about them is that at the very least they're a very democratic way of showing displeasure, and they're not actually necessarily completely stamping out freedom of speech. The biggest threat to our freedom of speech isn't people like ISIS, it isn't people like, ISIS are, but it isn't people like, petition signers and so on. The real kind of threats are people like the government who are recreating definitions like terrorism to suit their needs, to arrest people and send them to Guantanamo and so on. So that's the real problem. So I think, to be honest, I've brought up a topic here that's actually not completely, it's kind of putting a wool over our eyes almost. It's almost like a kind of gatekeeper topic, in a sense that it shows us the extent of freedom of speech problems, the kind of idea of society showing displeasure and not accepting certain views. But the reality is that actually it's not really stopping freedom of speech. People are still getting to say what they want. People are just also expressing that they don't believe in it, and that's not how they feel, right? The actual real problem with freedom of speech is people like governments, people like ISIS, who are using force or whatever to actually stop us from saying stuff. I guess that's the real crux of it. And it's just interesting.
Definitely. Yeah. I think if that's subject, I think it's a brilliant way to end the podcast.
Yeah, I think it is as well. Anyway, it's another debate we'll probably have in the future again.
All right, great. So thank you very much, Paul, and everyone else who's listening out there. Until next time.